I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Online Communist Forum. I'd like to introduce Ed Griffiths, who's a lecturer from Oxford University. And Ed is going to speak on the question or the results for the left in the recent May elections.
Well, thank you, Chair. Thanks, everybody, for coming along. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to speak on this subject. And I say that partly because I really am grateful, but partly also because I want to discreetly say that I didn't suggest this topic. So if you don't find local council election results thrilling, then take it up with the organizers. The mot d'ordre for socialists now is convert the electors and capture the county councils. That was Annie Besant of the Fabians and the Theosophical Society. And probably you've got to be quite Fabian to be very excited about county council results. Believing in the Theosophical Society and Madame Blavatsky is optional. Also, unlike in Annie Besant's time, the county councils, which these elections largely were, don't include the larger cities. So up to a point, this round of elections was always likely to be something of an away fixture for the far left, because areas where there might, within living memory, have been some base of support, or at least where left groups have more of their organization, which is generally going to be in the larger cities. We're not contesting elections, except maybe the odd by-election. So I will run over the results and just say one or two things that the results seem to throw up, and hopefully comrades will have plenty of things to say in the discussion. Most of the results that I'm going to be talking about are for Tusk, the Socialist Party ex-militant electoral alliance with itself, simply because most of the far left candidates who were standing were doing so under the Tusk label. Tusk had about 100 candidates. The Communist Party of Britain, Morning Star, and the Socialist Party of Great Britain, Socialist Standard, had 4 candidates each, and the Socialist Labour Party had 1, Transform had 1, and there may be the odd others up and down, as well as people who are in fact members of far left organizations but were standing as independent candidates, which I'll talk about separately. I realize there are differences of opinion about whether the Workers' Party of Britain, the George Galloway vehicle, should be counted as a left organization or as part of the far left. My own view is that it shouldn't, but for those who are interested, I think they had 5 candidates in the council elections, as well as standing in the Runcorn by-election. So the bulk of the left challenge was represented by those 100 or so Tusk candidates. Following, I think, the established electoral strategy of that organization, which is to put up as many candidates as they physically can. Extreme example would be Hertfordshire, where there were 19 Tusk candidates who averaged 0.9% of the vote. Now, I think the idea that Tusk or any left group or the far left altogether has the activists in Hertfordshire to be able to canvass or to cover that number of divisions I think is fanciful. It's worth noting that in local elections, unlike in parliamentary elections, you don't get a free delivery of your election address. In a general election, you have to pay a £500 deposit to stand, but then if you print a leaflet, it will be distributed around the voters for nothing. That's not true in a local council election. There's no deposit. You only need 2 signatories rather than 10 to get nominated. But then there's no free distribution of your election address. So my guess would be that the majority of people who had the opportunity to vote for far left candidates on the 1st of May did not know they had that opportunity until they saw the ballot paper when they got to the polling station. And in fact, given that the turnout in local elections is usually low, I think it was around 35%. Probably the majority of potential voters for the far left organizations still don't know that there was a left group standing. The results typically for Tusk, I think the lowest nationwide was 0.3%. They were typically around 1%. And a few got in the 2%, 4%, that kind of bracket. Only 2 did noticeably better than that. And I can't really explain why those particular candidates, and that would require local knowledge that I haven't got. The best in percentage terms was the Tusk candidate in one of the divisions in Nuneaton, who got 11%. Not challenging to win the division, but clearly indicating some degree of support. The other one, in percentage terms, it comes out a bit lower, because another difference between general elections and local council elections is that in some parts of the country, local council elections use multi-member wards or divisions. So each voter can vote for up to 2 or up to 3 candidates. And that makes it a little bit difficult to calculate the percentage. There's no unambiguous way of knowing what percentage of voters, if the far left only has 1 candidate for 3 vacancies. But there was a ward in Doncaster where Tusk had 1 candidate for 3 vacancies and came 6th with just under 900 votes, behind the 3 Reform UK who were elected, and 2 of the 3 Labour, then Tusk, then the other Labour, and Tory and Lib Dem and whatever. That's the only place in the country in these elections where if you doubled the Tusk result, they would have been elected. If you double the Tusk vote, then they would just have beaten the 3rd of the 3 Reform UK. So, okay, not a marginal, but again, indicative of some level of support. It will be possible because a lot of these seats were largely last contested in 2021. And it would be possible Tusk had candidates then, although not in exactly the same wards and divisions necessarily, but there is quite a lot of overlap. But I'm not particularly going to go over the differences, whether the vote was up by 0.2% or down by 0.2%. because I think there's a random fluctuation, and it doesn't necessarily at that level mean anything. Even when the differences are a bit more substantial, I don't think you can systematically say that there's an increase or decrease in the far left vote, but there may be local factors. In one of the divisions in Lincoln, Tusk went up from 2.4% to 4.4%. Okay, that might be something real. In one of the divisions in Folkestone, the SPGB went down from 2.6% to 0.9%. And okay, again, that might indicate something. That might indicate some real change. But if it does, then I think that's local things. That's the activity or otherwise of the branches, or who knows what. But I don't think it reveals much of a national picture. There were, incidentally, two places where Tusk and the SPGB both had a candidate. Tusk did a little better both times. In one of them, Tusk got 30 votes, 3-0, and the SPGB got 10. In the other, Tusk got 45, I apologize, 49, and the SPGB got 25. So if you take those results at face value, it looks as though for every 2 or 3 people who will vote for no cuts, there's one who will vote for complete abolition of capitalism with no transitional period. I'm not quite sure that the results are to be taken at face value, but that does, I think, point up something real about these results and other recent local council results, which is that any benefit that left organizations get by standing on a moderate friendly program, rather than talking about the socialist or communist objective, any benefit they get from that is very marginal. Somewhat similarly, you can say the CPB, now whatever the exact manifestos, the name Communist Party of Britain is spikier than the name Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition appearing on the ballot paper. But the CPB candidates, I think the best got 1.4% or something like that, the worst got 0.4. It was around those sort of numbers. In other words, pretty typical results. It wouldn't surprise anybody if those had been Tusk results. And that's perhaps especially noticeable given that Tusk's framing is not quite as a single issue anti-austerity vehicle, but it puts a lot of emphasis on anti-austerity. And you might think that in these elections, where the popularity of the Labour government is dropping through the floor, and part of the reason why it's dropping through the floor is austerity and cuts to winter fuel allowance and disability benefits and etc. There is public anger, and you might think that Tusk, which the logo on the ballot paper has Tusk against cuts, that if there was going to be an election where that message would cut through, then it was likely to be this election where you would expect to see some sign of it. By and large, you don't, I think, see much sign of it. There's those couple of good results, one in Nuneaton, one in Doncaster, but there usually are. In last year's council elections, again, for Tusk, there was a large number of candidates, and one or two of them did well. One of the wards in Southampton, they did come within a reasonable shot of winning it, although they didn't win. So normally there would be one or two comparatively strong results against a general background of a very low vote. And that's basically the story this time as well. Any sorts of, although you might think that a lot is going on, that the collapse in support for Labour, that the surge of Reform UK, that other things, the tranquil bottom of the ocean where the left's vote is, none of that really registers. This is no different from the result that the left usually gets. It's not even really possible to say that this was a better or worse. It's a typical result, and it indicates an extremely low level of support. And when left organisations are standing like Tusk on the friendly, broad, no cuts, anti-austerity agenda, then it enormously understates the support that potentially exists for that politics. I don't know whether the SPGB getting 0.9% in Folkestone understates as radically the support that potentially exists for their manifesto, but certainly the Tusk type, and I voted for Tusk in these elections, and in fact I campaigned for Tusk. I did a couple of stints knocking on doors in Oxford where I live, and I have done in the past for other of these other of the other left groups that were standing. I've campaigned and voted for the SPGB and the SLP in my time. I've never had the opportunity to vote for the CPB or for Transform, but if that were who was standing around here, then I would. And given that they are standing, I would try to help them out. You know, I would try to increase the vote rather than decrease it. I don't know whether the canvassing that was done in Oxford made very much of a difference. And frankly, the number of people who were mobilised to campaign for Tusk in Oxford in these elections was extremely small, and the vast majority of the electorate would never have got a Tusk leaflet, would never have, you know, whether they were going to vote for it or not. I realise that it's possible to argue. It's possible to argue that the Marxist left should have nothing to do with bourgeois elections at all. Anti-parliamentary communism is a very respectable, long-standing part of the British far left. It's not my position, and I'm not particularly concerned to argue against it today. But it's possible to argue that. I would just say that I don't see anybody working towards setting up workers' councils or revolutionary base areas in the countryside, or any other strategy that involves any kind of contestation for power, or the left putting itself forward as potentially, you know, this is how we think society ought to be, which an election gives you an opportunity to do, and gives you an opportunity potentially to engage with broad masses of the public, as opposed to campaigning on single issues, which inevitably the left spends a lot of its time talking about single issues. There were also some members of left organizations who stood in these elections, but stood as independents. One of whom was elected, Michael Lavalette in Preston, who I think is a member of Counterfire. Although I don't absolutely take that to the bank. I mean, there are probably people who follow these things more closely than I do, but I believe he's a member of Counterfire. And he was quite convincingly elected in his ward or in his division in Preston. I think to a certain extent as part of a campaign to elect pro-Gaza independents. But he's also longstanding, he was a Socialist Alliance councillor there, he was a Respect councillor there. He's stood under the Tusk names all back when he was in the SWP. He won his division very comfortably. A member of the SWP stood as an independent in Chesterfield and didn't win, but got 7.5%. Respectable result and better than the far left groups typically do. And I think one thing that emerges quite clearly from these results is that having the endorsement of a left organization actively puts off more voters than it attracts. Purely opportunistically, you will get more votes standing as an independent than you would standing as a Tusk candidate, CPB candidate, SPGB candidate, whatever it might be. And up to a point, you can see that clearly from, again, one of the Doncaster results. Tusk now, with the Electoral Commission, as well as the official name of a party, you can register various different ballot paper descriptions, which is what actually comes up on the ballot paper next to the candidate's name. And as well as Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, they've got the Electoral Commission to accept independent trade union and socialist candidate as a Tusk ballot paper description. I will just say in brackets, the Electoral Commission is, there seems to be very little logic about which ballot paper descriptions, which logos, etc., it will accept and which it won't. If you look on the Electoral Commission website, they publish for each month the applications for registration and whether they've approved them or rejected them. And for the most recent month that they've published it for, which is March, about a third of the applications were rejected, usually because the form was incomplete, is what appears next to it. And I think if you're any kind of bureaucratic organization producing any kind of form, if one person fills it in wrong, that's probably their fault. But if a third of the people who try end up filling it in wrong, and this month wasn't unusual, every month there are dozens of organizations that presumably have tried their best to fill it in correctly, and they get turned down for one reason or another. It's a completely arbitrary and unpredictable hurdle that it puts in the way of new parties or minor parties. Anyhow, Tusk now has the option of using the ballot paper description independent trade union and socialist candidate. In other words, of downplaying the extent to which it's a left organization and suggesting that it's almost an independent. In one of the wards in Doncaster, two Tusk candidates stood using that independent trade union and socialist candidate name, and one stood using the proper Tusk name, Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. The two that had the independent word got about 200 votes each, one just above, one just below. And the one that had Tusk got about half that, just under 100 votes. And again, there might be local factors, there might be popular, there might be personal vote or personal anti-vote for those individuals. But it suggests to me that there are people who will vote for independence or for what look like independence, who are less willing to vote for something if it looks like a left group. Another example suggesting the same thing, and this is locally here in Oxford, a former Labour councillor who left the Labour Party over Gaza, Jabunala Hartley, stood in her ward as a complete independent in the city council elections. A year ago, didn't get re-elected. Tried again in the county council elections, by now having formed something called Oxford Community Socialists, supported locally by RS21 and the CPB and various other forces. I can't tell you what the word community in the title means. I'm probably an Oxford non-community socialist. But she stood again this time as the candidate of Oxford Community Socialists. This was the county rather than the city, but the area that she stood for covered the whole of the city ward and some more. And the vote was down from 173 votes to 13.7% down to 143 votes, 8 point something percent. So that suggests that the exact same candidate, but standing this time with something that looks a little bit like the name of a left group, Oxford Community Socialists, looks a bit like the name of a left group, that cost her votes rather than adding any potential support. So purely opportunistically, the line of least resistance for left organizations would be to stand candidates as independents. And I don't want to make an enormous point of principle that you should never, ever stand as an independent. Because standing as an independent is a tactic, and there might be times when that's the right thing to do. In general, I don't think it is. I think it almost inevitably leads to trying to build up a personal vote for the individual, which then doesn't transfer to a wider movement. It means you're offering somebody as your Burkean representative, rather than offering them as a member of a putatively democratic political party. Why is there a bigger vote for the same candidate, probably with the exact same opinions, when they have independent next to their name? Well, some of it might be attracting votes from people who aren't on the left at all, but who think, oh, independent, that sounds good. But I think among sections of the electorate who might be disillusioned former Labour supporters post-Corbyn, there is a tendency to reject the idea of political parties. I think, oh, we don't like all those horrible machines. What I want is my local representative who can vote according to their conscience. And so that plays to the idea of independent candidates. And I don't think that's actually a productive direction. I don't think that's the way we should want things to go. I think it's better to have candidates who are nominated by a political party through some democratic procedure and who are accountable and who are under the control of that party and who are standing on an agreed manifesto. I think the other element of it possibly is that voting for an independent candidate might be a way of not quite completing the break from Labour in your head. That rather than thinking, I'm not a Labour voter anymore, I am now a Tusk voter or a CPB voter or generically the far left voter, which I suppose is what I am. Rather than thinking, I don't support Labour, I want Labour to lose and my new party to win. You think, well, I'm still Labour, really. I'm still basically Labour. But this leader or this candidate, I can't support them, so temporarily. And maybe when there's a better leader and a better candidate, we'll all get back together again. Like Ken Livingstone was welcomed back into the Labour Party, temporarily as it turned out, was welcomed back into the Labour Party after standing as an independent. So I think the drive to have independent candidates is not a sign of political maturity on the left, and it's not something that I think we ought to welcome. I would probably predict that we will see more of it. That people who would like there to be some kind of post-Corbynism movement will continue to be sympathetic to the idea of voting for independence. There was I saw this today online, Socialist Worker headline. Corbyn almost declares a new left challenge to Starmer. That's a newsworthy headline. And I suppose for some people, the vision of how this is meant to develop or the strategy going forward would be that we elect our independents, and they might be ex-Labour people or they might be whoever. And then gradually, organically, it forms together and we can build together something that eventually might grow into being almost a party. And that already feels an archaic, that feels a sort of 18th century way of getting to a political party, to elect your independent representatives first, and then they merge together to form a party. I think the likelihood of it working under circumstances where there is a masked Green Party is close to zero. Because if what you are looking for is a broad left, soft left, achievable reforms, continuation of Corbynism, etc., then it's very hard to avoid the conclusion at this point that the Green Party is it. Which in these council elections, I think won 79 councillors, which is up by 40 or something from what they'd had before. Supporters of the Green Party were disappointed with these council results, and possibly were rightly disappointed. But still, the level of electoral support that the Green Party has, the solidity of the Green Party as a more or less democratic political organisation, is an entirely different order of magnitude from any sort of new formation that will be cobbled together by the far left. And the difference between the Green Party manifesto and Corbynite Labour manifesto is not that great. It's true that the Green Party presently supports NATO membership. A reason why some on the left might refuse to have anything to do with the Green Party, or might rightly. But of course, the Labour Party, both of Corbyn's Labour manifestos supported NATO membership. And I find when I make this argument that people usually think I'm saying you should vote Green or you should join the Green Party. And I'm really not saying anything of the kind. I'm saying that if what you want is a vehicle for soft left achievable reforms somewhat to the left of social democracy, which isn't what I want, and I imagine it's not what comrades in this meeting want. If that's what you want, then good for you. There is such an organization, and I don't believe there is a niche in English electoral politics for another one. Is the chance of success by going down that road zero? I don't think it's zero, but it would be a little bit like there are rival Welsh nationalist parties besides Plaid Cymru. But still, broadly speaking, that niche is occupied. And I think the niche for a reformist, anti-austerity, left of Starmer party, I think the Greens occupy that niche. What electoral niche do the far left groups occupy? Well, based on these results, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to say any, and the fact that the vote is not very meaningfully up or down. Now, part of that, it's difficult, you see, to distinguish. Is it that nobody wants what the left groups are selling, or is it that the left groups don't manage to sell it to anybody? It's not nobody, but it's small numbers of people. And I do think that in these elections, the bulk of the potential electorate in most of the relevant divisions won't have known that the left groups were standing, and so whatever they might potentially think, I think a purely anti-austerity, no cuts, etc., centre-left program again probably comes up against the fact that the Green Party is there, and while its support is uneven across the country, but even when it does, even in areas where it does badly, there are very few divisions on the 1st of May where the far left groups did better than the Green Party. Not zero, but very few. So you have to explain to people why it's a better way, why voting Tusk or whatever is a better way of advancing that politics than voting for the Green Party. If you're standing for, if you're standing on a more explicitly socialist or communist program, then that at least wouldn't arise. And I think that's what I would ideally like to see. I don't think the vote would be lower, but still it would be an uphill struggle, and I'm not persuaded that it does any good to stand when you know you won't be able to cover the ward effectively in campaigning. I think members of left organisations sometimes think, we're not primarily trying to win votes, we're doing it for propaganda to get the message out, and we'll build the branch. What's this? We're doing it for propaganda to build the branch. I wonder whether the branch does get built. And propagandistically, I think it would be much more effective. Getting 10% is better propaganda than getting 1%. And I wonder how many of the people who think it will do that themselves joined the far left because somebody knocked on their door during an election and then went on to get 0.5%. And by doing that, left groups, there is a risk of making whatever kind of left politics, whether it's the comparatively moderate, no cuts, no austerity, or whether it's something more radical or revolutionary. There's a risk of making it look more fringe than it in fact is, by standing under circumstances when you're not going to be able to campaign effectively, and you're not going to be able to turn out even the vote that does potentially exist. I think that covers most of what I intended to. And the only other thing I would say is that I've mentioned airily the collapse in support for the Labour Party, which, although it's not directly the far left results, but it's a dramatic wider result from these council elections, and the rise in support for Reform UK. And I will say on those subjects just very quickly that I think quite a lot of people on the far left, there's a temptation to be gleeful. Look how badly Labour's doing, look how Labour's getting smashed, look how Labour is collapsing. And to imagine that in itself, the collapse of the Labour Party, if its support is indeed collapsing, as somewhat equivalent parties in France or in the Netherlands or in some other countries their support has created. The temptation to think that if that happens, then that opens the way for the left. That if the fake Workers' Party gets out of the way, then that opens the way to real working class politics. And that, I think, slightly reminds me of what I think quite a few people on the far left might have said in, for example, the 1980s, thinking about the USSR, that if it would just collapse, if these, if the bureaucratic fake socialism would just get out of the way, then that would open the path for genuine socialism. It hasn't really happened, and I don't think there's any reason to think that the collapse of parties left over from the Second International or left over from the Third, that in itself those parties collapsing doesn't do any good for the left. I'm not saying we should prop up Labour if we could, but I'm saying we shouldn't necessarily expect that the left will rise automatically because Labour is doing badly. And I think as far as Reform UK is concerned, I tend to be skeptical about how much of its support is generated by anything other than very sympathetic press coverage, which could probably still be turned off. But just anecdotally, a couple of days after the election result, in Oxford, the Trades Council does a May Day march every year, and it doesn't do it on May Day, it does it on the Saturday after. I don't know why. But I went on that, which I've been going on for decades. It was a very small march, which it usually is. And from passers-by, and especially from motorists, there was a hostility that I've never experienced before. There were people shouting and honking their horn and so on. And it's purely anecdotal, and it might be anything, but I wonder whether that's Reform UK supporters feeling buoyant, that was a day or two after the elections, even in a relatively non-reform voting area, which Oxford is. And that made me think, if that was what was going on, that made me think that a certain demographic layer or a certain group of people feel that Reform UK is their political expression. And for something that is a real political party, I think you would have some identifiable layer or stratum or some group of the public who think of that party as being their political expression, their political voice, or their political vehicle. And I don't think the existing far left has that at all. So I'll stop there. I realise that's been largely negative, and probably predictably negative. I've taken up 50 minutes of your time telling you that the left doesn't get many votes in elections, which you probably knew already. Probably social Catholicism would have more to say about trade unions than those SWP 6 points. I mean, we've all been rereading Rerum Novarum because of the new Pope. I think it does pass the Vatican test, but I think the way I would characterize it is sort of minimal common sense progressivism. Common sense meaning among a wide left and centre left. It's meant to be the common sense minimum. Something it shares with Tusk is that the principle with Tusk, or the idea with Tusk, is that the Tusk policies are the bare minimum necessary, and then organizations or individuals are free to campaign for more than that. And that's how those SWP principles are being presented. I mean, certainly the Green Party would pass those principles. This wasn't in one of the discussions, but I saw one of the text chat which go flying by, and I haven't really seen what people have been saying in them. I apologize. I saw somebody saying quite correctly that I'd said I was going to talk about the Workers' Party of Britain and then didn't at all. In the scheme of things, there's nothing to tell. One of their candidates did substantially better than the general run of the far left, which was a by-election in a ward in Rochdale, where it's the continued Galloway effect from last year and the year before. The vote was slightly down from last year, down from 19% to 17%. Actually, I'm surprised it held up so well. There is clearly still a base of support there. The others were 1 point something. I think one of them got to 4%, but they were typical Tusk style results. I suppose, I mean, Zach Polanski, I've been a bit bewildered by sections of the left deciding that Zach Polanski is the hero and the savior. Maybe it shows the appetite for personality cults, that anybody who will put themselves forward as a potential object for a personality cult. I'm not certain that Polanski is even on the left of the Green Party. But there is, I think, the idea that somebody mentioned of revolutionaries pretending to be reformists, I think is important, because I think in fact nobody is fooled really, and I suppose it doesn't start out necessarily as a completely cynical, I'm going to pretend to hold the popular opinions, because even the ones that they pretend to hold are not necessarily very popular. I think a lot of the British far left, I think this certainly applies to Tusk stroke SP stroke militant, and probably to other forces as well, that they ideally would see themselves as the left wing of a broad front that includes forces well to the right of them. And given that those forces to the right of them largely are not organized, or if they are organized, are not interested in being in that alliance, they end up having to synthesize what they think would be acceptable positions to a broad alliance, even though mostly the right wing of the broad alliance isn't even in the room. And I think that's a mistaken approach, but I think that's probably why they do it. And the idea of a Labour Party Mark II, I mean, there has, in a sort of informal and disorganized way, been something like a split from the Labour Party over the last 5 years, in that lots of councillors and lots of members and so on, who were members of the Labour Party in 2019, 2020, have either left it or have been expelled. But there's been no organised split. None of those people have left as a coherent group with a set of policies. They've left in ones as individuals. If it had happened as an organised split, then in the same way that the left has always since 1900 or 1906 debated the right way to relate to the Labour Party, if there were a split from the Labour Party, an organised left social democratic group, then obviously the left would discuss, do we do entryism in it, or do we apply to affiliate to it, or do we try and expose it, or do we ignore it, or what? And that debate would have to happen. In the absence of such an organisation, there's really no point revolutionaries trying to fake it up themselves. Standing in elections to measure our support, very important. I'm not sure that these results do distinguish our support from zero. And what should the left be doing in elections? I mean, as comrades have said, there's probably there's no magic answer at this point. I do agree that given the choice, I think the way the SPGB does it is preferable to the way some other left groups do it. Not because it gets more votes, but it doesn't at all. But because at least they are making arguments for things that they think are true, which the other left are not necessarily. But I think if you think of it rather than thinking about what should the left do in elections specifically, but if you assume that we want to get to a situation where large numbers of people agree that capitalism needs to be abolished and a socialist or communist order needs to be brought in instead. And at the moment, some people agree with that, but a lot of people don't. And what we would like to do well in elections, because we would like a successful election result to register the fact that more people are coming to agree with that, agree with those opinions. If people don't agree with those opinions, then even if you can trick them into putting a cross in a box on election day, I'm not sure you've really gained anything. And by and large, you can't trick them into doing it. I'll shut up and let other people come in. Point. Abolish the Electoral Commission. I absolutely agree with that. It doesn't do what it was claimed to do. It's enormously it is an inscrutable bureaucracy, and yeah, I think opposing that. The question of name recognition, well, I mean, people have talked about the Socialist Party in England and Wales having an unfortunate acronym. The name they should use is Militant Tendency. That's the name that still has name recognition. And Tusk still to this day talks in its election literature about the achievements of Liverpool Council in the 1980s. So absolutely, that's the name they should have stuck with. The Socialist Alliance, which has been mentioned, and at around the same time was the height of the SLP of Scargill, and both of those did do better than the left groups do today. And I think part of the reason is that they managed to generate some excitement among potential activists or people who might campaign for them. I don't think Tusk has ever generated a great deal of excitement. Standing saying we're going to get 1%, or standing in a small number of constituencies, that's absolutely a legitimate thing to do. That's absolutely fine thing to do. But I think you need to be able to explain to the people you're asking to vote for you, why are we doing this? If it's not that we're going to win, if it's not that this is our fantasy manifesto for how we're going to run the government. Early left organizations, or pioneering organizations in the history of the British left, built up in part through standing in elections. That's absolutely a history that we need to study. I think we could possibly also learn something from the way non-left or non-working class parties have built themselves up and got a niche in the political system, and that might be the Greens, that might be the SNP, and so on. The comrade who mentioned standing for the Alliance for Green Socialism, I think a strength of that organisation is that it didn't give up standing against Labour during Corbyn, although the votes it got were very small. Our comrade asked about whether capitalism is working well for me because I do some university teaching. You'd be astonished. It's not working that well for me, to the extent that that's relevant. Can socialism be legislated through Parliament? No, it can't. But the point of standing in elections, as I think comrades have said, is only partly in order to win a seat. And at the moment, it largely isn't that, because that's not on the table. It's also to speak to large numbers of people, to try to persuade them, and ideally to succeed in persuading them. So it's part of a process of building support and building the kind of movement and the kind of class organisation that would be capable of bringing in socialism. There are probably other things, but my connection is on its last legs. So I think I will just thank everybody and stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed. We did have some technical problems with your freezing there and your screen. But on behalf of everybody, can I just thank Ed for a very interesting discussion. Can I remind comrades of the Palestine demo next Saturday if you are able to attend? The demonstration in London would be deeply appreciated. And that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next week.